If anybody wonders what Justice in Action is, it was formerly SUSO, Step Up, Step Out, to end the culture of violence. But we got more and more into justice issues, and we decided to reframe ourselves. And so now we are Justice in Action. So good evening. I'm Nancy Kirchmeyer, a member of Asylum Hill Congregational Church, and I'd like to welcome you to Justice in Action Presents, a series of monthly conversations about justice-related issues. Tonight's topic is Dismantling Structural Inequities in Housing Development, with guest speaker Tim Hollister, a longtime AHCC member. Tim is a land use lawyer with Hinckley Allen and is recognized both regionally and nationally for his work in workforce and affordable housing development, with expertise in civil rights violations, fair housing, inclusionary zoning, and much more. Recently, he's been working on the Woodbridge development proposal, which you may have read about in The Current. We are so fortunate to have Tim speak to us tonight to further our understanding of fair share housing and zoning. We hope that one day Connecticut will no longer be one of the nation's most segregated states. Tim received his education at Wesleyan University, Occidental College, and Boston University School of Law. He will speak for 30 minutes, after which we'll have a time for Q&A and your comments. Welcome, Tim.
Well, thank you. Nice to see everybody. And I will tell you that when the email went out the other day, who would like to usher at the resumption of in-person services? Tim and Christina's hands went up electronically in a flash, and we will see you Sunday. And we are really excited to usher in the renewed era of our beloved church. And, longtime member, just saying, next year, 40 years for me. That's a long time. So I also want to say that Tracy and I have a sort of a special bond that you may not know about. So, Tracy went to the Coast Guard Academy, and then she was the chaplain at Wesleyan. I went to Wesleyan, and for about 20 years now, some of my best friends have been faculty at the Coast Guard Academy, because I have a regular Saturday morning golf group that are all faculty at the Coast Guard Academy. So I know a lot about the Coast Guard Academy. So Tracy and I have that kind of funny bond. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to talk about, just to give you a little background, how I became an affordable housing lawyer. Probably not a route you would guess. Then I'm going to just tell you a quick story that puts Connecticut in national perspective. I'm going to tell you a little affordable housing humor to make a central point about affordable housing. And then I'm going to talk about the topic, structural inequities in land use and how they perpetuate segregation and exclusion. I'll talk a little bit about the Woodbridge case, which not only was in The Current on Sunday or Monday, but the zoning commission's first deliberations were Monday night. And so that is very much at the top of my mind. And then I'll finish by just giving you an update, a sad update on the bills in the legislature about affordable housing this year, which have been dying on the vine one by one as the session comes to an end. So I became a lawyer in Connecticut in 1982. And in 1983, as a second-year lawyer, I was handed the case of Eddie Markham. Eddie Markham was a plumber who lived in the town of East Hampton in a trailer. What he could afford. And he inherited a little over an acre of land from his family. This property, and you all know where East Hampton is. It's sort of near Marlborough, 20 miles east of Hartford. He inherited this land, which had been in his family since 1720. So it's not like he was some carpetbagger who, flew into Connecticut. This was a family that had been part of the bedrock of Connecticut for hundreds of years. Eddie wanted to build an 800 square foot house, 20 by 40 roughly. Not a big house, not a small house, 800 square feet. The zone of the town of East Hampton, where his property was located, the zoning rules said that he had to build at least 1,200 square feet. And he said to ask the town, well, why do I have to build 1,200 square feet? I don't need 1,200 square feet. I'm a single person. I don't have a family. And it will add 40% to my building costs, and I can't afford that. Town denied his building permit. So he took his case to court. This is 1984. And we proved that there was no public health or safety reason why the town would require 1,200 square feet. It was what, just as an aside, it was the only time in my legal career when I actually had the world's leading expert as my star witness. Professor Eric Mood of the Yale School of Public Health, who had done all the worldwide epidemiology studies about transmission of airborne diseases and established the public health code, which is the minimum square footage that people need in order to live healthfully in a residential environment. And Eddie needed 250 square feet, and the town was making him build 1,200. So long story short, we took it to the Superior Court, and we lost because the judge didn't want to upset the town of East Hampton. And then we took it to the Connecticut Supreme Court. And I argued the case in October of '87, and in March of 1988, the Connecticut Supreme Court ruled that this was exclusionary zoning that had no rational relationship to any legitimate purpose of zoning. And so they invalidated the so-called minimum floor area zoning regulation. Now, what happened after, so that was March of '88. This is also the time when New Jersey was ramping up its so-called Mount Laurel doctrine, fair share. Every municipality has to have some affordable housing. And Massachusetts was moving toward legislation to promote affordable housing. So the Connecticut legislature took note of the Eddie Markham case and said, boy, you know, if we don't do something, the courts are going to do it for us. And so there was a Blue Ribbon Commission. If any of you remember the great UConn law professor, Terry Tondreau, his wife Hella he and his wife Hella were occasional visitors at Asylum Hill. But anyway, Terry was co-chair of the Blue Ribbon Commission on Affordable Housing, which recommended that we adopt what is now known as Section 830G, which is Connecticut's Affordable Housing Statute. And since I had won the case and had gotten the attention of the legislature, I became scrivener, and I'm not going to say it was anything more than that, scrivener to Professor Tondreau, who asked me to write certain sections of the bill, which I did. And, you know, then the bill passed, and, you know, people started saying, oh, yeah, the young attorney Hollister, he's the one that wrote the bill, which I wasn't going to quibble with that as the narrative. And I ended up getting the first case under the new statute and winning it, and off we go. 220 cases later, I can say I've only lost 2, and that's been good, but that's only not because I'm a great lawyer, but because we've been able to pick our cases carefully. So that's how I became an affordable housing lawyer. Now, next, I just want to put Connecticut in perspective. This is a true story. About 10 years ago, I was in San Antonio giving a talk, and I was escorted to the meeting room by a very pleasant young man who said, where are y'all from? Now, this is in San Antonio, Texas. And I was going to say Hartford, but I think he might not know what that is. So I said, Connecticut. And he looked at me and he said, that's one of them small states in the upper right. And I confirmed that. I said, yes, we're one of those small states in the upper right. So you have to understand that on the national level, we are one of those small states in the upper right, but that's an important part of the story. So let me now, and I realize I'm jumping around a little bit, let me start out with a little affordable housing humor, which is what I call the cycle. And this is sort of a theme in affordable housing over many years. The cycle goes like this. I represent an affordable housing developer who puts forth a plan that the local citizenry thinks is absolutely outrageous and will destroy the town. And it goes to the zoning commission for a public hearing, and there's, you know, chairs are thrown and tomatoes and nasty names and stuff like that. And then the zoning commission denies it, and then we go to court and we win in court, and the judge orders the development to be approved, and the development's built, and people, rent the apartments and move in, and now it's fully occupied and it's beautiful. And that finishes what I call the cycle, which is when the town identifies the housing as evidence of its commitment to affordable housing. So that's where we end up in the cycle. And that I've seen this movie countless times. So keep that in mind. So let me now turn to the more serious topic framed by what I've just said, please. So there are, somebody said segregated. Connecticut is one of the most segregated states in the country, and there are structural reasons for that. And much of what's been in the press and in the legislature, in the media recently, is aimed at trying to dismantle these structures that result in inequity. So what I'm going to do in the next couple minutes is try to explain to you what the structures are and how they perpetuate exclusion and segregation. And we'll start with what I call the overlooked importance of land use regulation. So municipal land use boards, planning, zoning, wetlands being the main ones, are sometimes considered to be sort of a governmental backwater, a place where patronage positions are doled out, but nothing important ever really happens. But consider the collective responsibilities of these local land use boards. Things like population density, traffic routing and circulation, traffic safety, commuting patterns, water quality, air quality, emergency response, stormwater response, flood control, coastal management, utility availability, open space preservation, property values. These are the commissions that determine for construction and rehabilitation how much, how close, how high, how wide, how dense, and how loud. They have the ability to create rules, but also to grant variances and waivers and exceptions. Their decisions really impact what investment and reinvestment is going to be in our communities. And looking ahead, these are the agencies that are at the forefront of climate change, global warming, environmental sustainability, energy efficiency, disaster planning and resilience, and even pandemics. Think about the spring of 2020. Who do you think had to stand to the side in order for us to have outdoor dining? It was all these zoning rules that if the restaurants had to apply for permits, we would have been dining outside in the winter. But the governor said, okay, we're going to push all that regulation aside, and so the zoning commissions went along with that. So we have to also realize that land use policy making and permit issuance and regulation involves very complex technical decisions about planning, and planning is an academic discipline. You can become a doctor, a PhD in planning, and there's also, of course, all these complex legal issues, private property rights, civil and constitutional rights, public regulatory authority, nuisances, non-conforming uses, jurisdiction. All this stuff is part of the mix. So the point is that local land use agencies have some very important functions, and they really are responsible for creating the fabric of our society as much of anything. So the second thing to think about is that we entrust these very important and very complex decisions to volunteers. Most land use commissioners in Connecticut are volunteers, unpaid, obviously, volunteers. And guess what? They're not required to have any training. There's a bill in the legislature right now to change that, but they're not required to have any training, none whatsoever. Now, so let's compare our local land use decisions to the numerous areas where the state of Connecticut, the state government, has either rescinded what used to be local control or never created local control in the first place. In other words, these are the things that are governed exclusively at the state level instead of the local level. Environmental protection, energy, public health, public utilities, telecommunications, transportation, and public safety, among others. all of these things are controlled by one set of professionals and experts at the state level with, essentially, sometimes local input. But think about the complete difference in the structure of regulation and permits and decisions between the areas that I just mentioned and local zoning, local planning, and local wetlands. The difference is just very stark. So the question becomes, okay, so why do we still lodge planning and zoning and wetlands and all the other local regulatory things about land use at the local level when all these other things are at the state level? Just hold that thought. So now let me turn to the structure of the governance of land use, and I'll illustrate it this way. Suppose you and I have a common relative. Let's call him Crazy Uncle Edgar. And now let's imagine that Uncle Edgar owns 100 acres of land, but he's getting too old to take care of it, and he decides to deed it to you and me as joint tenants. But in doing so, he wants to impose what lawyers call a deed restriction. You and I have to manage the land by dividing it into 169 separate parcels of approximately equal size, and we have to put a different person in charge of each one of those 169 squares. And by the way, 100 acres divided by 169 would be about 6/10 of an acre. Now, most likely you and I would say to Uncle Edgar, well, thank you for the gift, but we don't want any part of that because that's a ridiculous way to try to manage the land that you want to give us. I would suggest to you that the difference between that example and the state of Connecticut is one of degree, but not of substance, because we have 169 little fiefdoms, we call them in land use and many other contexts, 169 different jurisdictions where the land use is administered independently by volunteers at the local level. And by the way, I was told once, and I've never independently verified, that the size of the towns in Connecticut, which if you look at a map is relatively equal, was laid out in the mid 1700s, and the criteria was so that nobody had more than a half day's horseback ride to church in the center of town. Congregational church, of course, being the dominant force at that time. Okay, so now what is the state law that governs land use? Well, it's called the Zoning Enabling Act, General Statutes, Section 8-2, which is this very broadly worded grant of regulatory authority from the state to each town to govern land use, write regulations, adopt policies, grant or deny permits. Very few prohibitions, very few express prohibitions in the act. So the towns are given wide berth to do what they want. And this is reinforced by lack of oversight in the court system. Generally, unless there's a specific statute that withdraws this power from the local level, such as the state assigning all environmental protection matters to the DEEP, the judges are told, don't interfere with local decisions about land use and don't substitute your judgment for whatever the local town board or commission decides. So if you put all these pieces together, overall in Connecticut, we delegate broad authority with few checks over complex technical and legal issues to untrained volunteers operating in small geographic areas that have really nothing to do with land use and with little oversight from the judicial system. So that's the picture that I want to paint in your mind. So now, how do we tie this back to racial and economic segregation? Well, it is amply documented, and if you haven't read the book, The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, came out about 3 years ago, a wonderful book that just unbelievably meticulous research going back to really the first 50 years of the 1900s and pointing out how segregation based on race and economic and sometimes even religious criteria was not only legal, but was encouraged from top to bottom, from the highest levels of the federal government all the way down to the localities. And, so we see the fact that, again, what happened over time was that when the states felt like they had to manage energy or environmental protection or utilities in order to keep the state functioning, the untouchable third rail was leaving zoning decisions at the local level. So what in the 60s, as a part of the civil rights movement, what happened was that, Congress and many of the state legislatures enacted specific remedies for the worst excesses of regulation at the local level. Just, zoning regulations that had any hint of outright racial, characteristics or things that were just obviously wrong. So that's the federal and state civil rights laws and the Fair Housing Acts. So we have remedies for discrimination, but the system that allowed the segregation to take root in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and has continued, that system still remains today. And if you remember nothing else of what I say, this is the most important point. The system that created the segregation still exists today, and the remedies are only at the margins. So what are the consequences of this structure for land use and segregation? Well, first, in my experience, land use commissioners, many of whom are well-meaning and hardworking, sometimes very long-serving, they are directed by law to consider the impacts of the benefits of a land use application within the four corners of their little town. And I had a matter last year in Norwalk, and the question was, well, what is this? What's in this for Norwalk? We tried to say, well, no, never mind Norwalk. This is going to benefit the region. We don't care about the region. I hear that all the time. We don't care about the region. We only care about our town. Second, very important reality: local land use officials are influenced by the fact that they live very personally and very proximately to the people who are affected by their decisions. And I'll come back to this when we talk about Woodbridge. Their motivation is to protect their neighbors from change. And I see that as a reality all the time. The next consequence is they are asked to make, as untrained volunteers, to make decisions about complex matters over which they don't really have any basis to overrule an expert like a traffic engineer, but they do so all the time. Many land use commissioners believe that towns have some inherent right to exclude anybody who doesn't live in the town, and that's legally, that's not true. We have this daunting lack of uniformity. I mean, one of the reasons I have a very busy job is there's 169 towns and 169 different rules about how you apply and how you get your permit and how the hearings are conducted. It doesn't really make any sense, but it keeps people like me busy, because the first thing you do when you go in is make sure you understand the little tiny nuances between town A and town C. Another interesting consequence of all this, balkanization, I guess is the right word, is whenever there is a need in Connecticut for a coordinated regional response, it's almost impossible to do. And the best example of that is, you remember the sweepstakes in the second half of 2018 for the second Amazon headquarters. They wanted municipalities to make proposals. So they weren't interested in any single Connecticut town. They were interested in regions. But Connecticut's legal structure of land use made it essentially impossible for Connecticut regions to put in a bid that was competitive with, say, Greater Louisville or Greater Baltimore or greater wherever county government, which is the antithesis of what we have. So what we're left with is the things that perpetuate segregation, which are devised at the local level, protected at the local level, and protected by the courts. Large lot zoning, bans or extreme limits on anything other than single family occupancy, very narrow definitions of what is a family. Those of you who live in the west end of Hartford know the Scarborough Street controversy from a couple years ago. Could a blended family of 11 people live together in a 6,000 square foot mansion? Hartford said no. And then you just have all these excessive application fees and regulations and things that make the most routine application very cumbersome. As an aside, there is a small number of towns, maybe 15 or 20, where land use commissioners are elected. I think that is one of the most pernicious systems we could devise. It's a race to the bottom. Who can campaign more against development and against affordable housing than the next candidate. It just creates this kind of weird competition. And so, you have campaign statements that are online that are just filled with bias and predetermination against multifamily and affordable housing. So that's the structure that we deal with. So it is this structure that led an advocacy group called the Open Communities Alliance, led by my friend Aaron Boggs, and assisted by the lawyers at the housing clinic at Yale Law School, to go looking for what is this, a suburban Connecticut town that just absolutely exemplifies all of the worst traits of exclusionary zoning. And they found their way to Woodbridge. And my role, and I don't want to undersell it or oversell it, I acted as a procedural advisor to the Yale law students who are, let me tell you, having 9 Yale law students at your beck and call was like a law firm partner's dream. And they're, these kids will be running the country someday, I guarantee it. But anyway, Woodbridge has 3,500 housing units. The median income in Woodbridge is about 145,000 compared to 64,000 in the region. They have 3,500 housing units, 13 affordable units. They do not allow multifamily development anywhere in the town. They have a so-called affordable housing regulation that has never been used because it is so cumbersome and so, so overlaid with unnecessary detail. And they have a documented history of resistance to really anything affordable and anything multifamily. And one of the things the Yale law students did, believe it or not, they went back to the 1930s, and when Woodbridge formed its first zoning commission, and they read the minutes of every meeting over 75 years and put together this unbelievably documented history of zoning in Woodbridge. And every time there was a proposal to amend the regulations to open things up a little bit, it was shot down. So the Woodbridge application, which was filed in the end of September of last year, is, I think, sort of brilliant in its simplicity. Here, and I'll just give you the main points. The proposal is on any minimum lot where you can build a single family home, generally 1.5 acres. You can build, this is the proposal, as of right, you can build a single family, a structure that conforms to the rules for a single family home, setbacks and height, stuff like that. As long as it meets the public health code, there's a septic system, you're not going to overload it, you're not going to threaten the water quality or anything like that. You could subdivide the internal floor area up to 4 units. At least one of which has to be affordable. So the nice thing about it is it doesn't disturb the zoning pattern in Woodbridge. It doesn't allow or require hundreds of apartments on a tiny little lot. It leaves the minimum acreage requirement in place, but says as long as you build a house that meets a McMansion, you can subdivide it into 1, 2, or 3, or 4 housing units, which brings down the cost of housing, and maybe you impose on one of those units an actual maximum income and maximum rent. So again, I think it's kind of brilliant in its simplicity. And if any of you watched the deliberations of the Woodbridge Zoning Commission last Monday night, they're really stuck as to they hate the proposal, 10-1 supposedly public opinion against it, but they're really struggling to find a way out. Certainly to find something that's legal or justifiable, and they're sort of flailing. So they will next continue their deliberations, I believe, on the 17th of May. They have the first week of June deadline, but it's going to be interesting to see how it's going to come out. And, predictably, I think it's going to end up in court. But it's a really good, I credit the Yale Law School and Open Communities Alliance for, finding the worst suburb in the state in terms of exclusionary zoning and challenging them in a way that they couldn't say they were being picked on without also acknowledging that, it was really, they had found the sort of the soft underbelly, the unjustifiable practice that really needed to be changed. Okay, let me finish with this and then we'll open it up to questions. I think Tracy gave me 30 minutes, so I think I'm pretty close. Okay, so there have been a couple of bills in the legislature. The main one is the one put forth by the group called Desegregate Connecticut, led by Professor Sarah Bronin. And that is just a very broad agenda of recommendations for changing the Zoning Enabling Act, opening up multifamily housing opportunities, curbing the worst and most exclusionary practices that we see, in many places around the state. Very practical, very forward-looking, and I don't have the inside track on legislative wisdom or insight, but my sense is, which I verified with some of the housing advocates in emails earlier this week, is that the really good provisions are being stripped out one by one. And so what may end up is something that sounds good on paper, but is probably not very effectual. The second big bill was the so-called Fair Share Bill, put forth by the Open Communities Alliance, very much modeled on the New Jersey fair share. Every town gets a numerical fair share goal of affordable housing units that they should zone for and approve and help get built. That died in the legislature on Monday when the Planning and Zoning Committee did not move it forward. There is a bill to require land use commissioners to get mandatory education, which seems like a a very easy thing to propose, but very controversial, and that bill is still alive. There is a bill that I believe is on the House calendar, meaning it's gone through committee, that requires towns to provide multifamily housing within half a mile of a train station or bus station or other transportation hub, so-called transit-oriented development. See where that goes. That's a good thing, but it's not like there aren't that many places in the state, because we only have two major rail lines, one going east-west along the shore and then south to north through the middle of the state. And then finally, there's yet another bill requiring each town to do a plan requiring affordable housing development. Nice sounding goal. History will show that such plans have been put together and then have gathered dust. So I'm not terribly optimistic that that's going to shake the foundations. So, what's certainly the fact that this has been a legislative session in the pandemic, expectations were not high, and maybe that was a good expectation. But, the legislative session does show the resistance that we see to, any type of systemic change regarding land use and affordable housing. So let me stop there. I've been watching. We seem to have as many participants as we started with. That's always a good sign. So Nancy, Tracy, whatever, I'm going to throw myself on the mercy of the court and open it up to questions.
Thank you so much, Tim. I'm taking notes here, and I feel like I'm going to need to watch this video again later to really soak it all in. There will be a video available on our YouTube channel after this presentation, maybe in the next day or so. So does anyone have any questions? And if so, you can kind of raise your hand, or you can unmute yourself and start speaking, or you can type them into the chat. And I see someone already did that. So we'll start with this question. Why are affordable units only deed restricted or government owned?
Well, I think the thinking is it's not every affordable unit is formally deed restricted or government owned. But it is true that if the government is going to give you either money seed money for your development, or, construction money, or low interest loan. They want to know that some of their investment is going to assist families of lower income, sort of a quid pro quo. So a lot of the money that is devoted to assisting affordable housing development comes with strings attached, requiring that some percentage of the units be deed restricted, or somehow required over a period of years, 20, 30, 40 years, to be preserved for households that earn, let's say, less than 50,000 a year, or 20,000 a year if it's very low income. So that's the trade-off that we see all the time in most of the government-sponsored programs. So what's called the federal low-income housing tax credit, the panoply of programs run by the Connecticut Housing Finance Authority and the Connecticut Department of Housing. So that's why you.
Thank you. So we have a great question here that I want to make sure that maybe we close with this question, but I'm just going to ask so you can start thinking about it, Tim. But to think about the question, where is the hope and how can we help? So just start mulling on that, and we're going to make sure we maybe end with that question. And here's another question. In Massachusetts, the denial or approval of affordable housing on the local level must be appealed to a state agency that makes sure the affordable housing law is followed. Do you agree that this type of state oversight is needed?
Well, that Connecticut's affordable housing statute that was passed in 1989, and which I've been working on ever since, is very much modeled again after Massachusetts. We refer to Massachusetts as the mothership. The difference between Connecticut's system and Massachusetts is Massachusetts directs it to an administrative committee. If there's a denial at the local level, we direct it to the courts. We could debate which one is better, which one is cheaper, faster, more expeditious, but that's the difference. So the difference, not to get into the weeds, but the difference is in Connecticut, if you agree as a developer to set aside 30% of your units for low and moderate income households, and you seek zoning approval and it gets denied, you go to court, and the town, the local commission that denied you, has the burden to show that the denial was based on public health or safety. So that's the stick, if you will, instead of a financial carrot that we use, and that's very similar to what they do in Massachusetts. So it goes to a different place, but the shifting of the burden of proof to justify the denial in our system is the same as it is in Massachusetts.
Thank you. Christy.
Yeah, Tim, at one point when you were talking about zoning and enabling laws at the state level were very broad, you also commented that judges are told not to interfere with local zoning issues. That sounds like it wouldn't be legal to tell judges that they can't interfere. Did I misunderstand you?
Well, no, I mean, in general, now remember, there's a difference. In the Affordable Housing Act, the judges are told to put the screws to the local zoning commission and make them prove their case. But that act was adopted because in the normal zoning context, everything else, judges are told, as long as the local zoning commission has some reasonable basis for what they do, it should be hands off. You defer, the judges defer to the local discretion. So
a follow-up question, who is it that tells these judges?
Well, it's the way the way the Zoning Enabling Act is written.
Oh, okay.
It's also just how what's called case law has evolved in Connecticut Supreme Court over time. It's the difference between the legislative branch and the judicial branch. Judges are not supposed to make policy, really in any context. And they're just, as Chief Justice Roberts famously said, they're supposed to call balls and strikes and not, who gets to live where. That's the prerogative of the legislative branch, which in zoning is at the local level is the zoning commission.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So we do have someone in the, oh, Courtney, would you like to go? And then I'll read a question from the chat after Courtney.
Tim, am I correct in understanding that the Woodbridge application has been presented to the zoning board? They have to make a decision, and then based on their decision, an appeal will be taken to court or not? I mean, if they approve the zoning, then there would be no appeal, right? If they don't approve it, then you go to court.
Right, that's correct. If they approve it, which I haven't met anybody who expects that to happen, yes, if there's a denial or a, something that they claim looks like an approval but really isn't, yeah, we'd probably end up in court. That's no surprise there.
The other impression I have listening with our 169 towns is that even if you succeed in Woodbridge on this particular application, it doesn't solve the problem statewide. Is that correct? And would the desegregate Connecticut do that if it were passed?
I'm glad you asked that question. The fundamental question in Woodbridge, which may not apply in every town, but certainly applies in the worst towns across the state, which number 25, 30, 40 towns, is can a town use its zoning regulations to completely exclude multifamily development, duplexes, triplexes, and anything above that? That's the first issue in Woodbridge. And so we sort of feel like we're, as the applicant team, we're trying to pry open that door, which historically has been shut. So I think those of us who are working on the case think that, whether you call it a statewide impact, it's going to have an impact if we get a court to say that is a misuse of the zoning power.
My only comment was, given the history, it seems to me it's an uphill battle. Even if you get some clout out of an Oldham decision in Woodbridge, moving forward in any major way across the state in 169 towns seems to me a long process.
Well, all of this is very much a long process, and I guess Kathleen asked, where's the hope? Part of the hope is that between Woodbridge and the bills that have been considered in the legislature this year, it's too bad it's a pandemic year, but the state of Connecticut, let's look on the bright side, has had a discussion about multifamily and affordable housing this year that has been more robust than any in my lifetime. And that's a good thing. And, that's where change starts, is that you expose, the issues and the unfairness. And, I hope some form of Sarah Bronin's bill is passed by the legislature, because what she's trying to do in a very real way is to stop the towns from doing the things that look innocuous but really block affordable housing, like excessive application fees, where it really is a tax and not anything related to the town's administrative cost to process the application. Across the board, her bill is aimed at the worst practices. So, this is how you make progress, by wiping away obstacles, whether they're, big, small, or in between. So I don't think it's a fool's errand. I really don't.
Yeah. So Tim, someone did mention a good question here. This person, can sympathize with some of the concerns about additional noise and traffic specifically related to the Woodbridge situation, and ask the question, what is to prevent the Woodbridge 4-unit requirement from opening up the possibility of there being other units that constitute large multifamily apartments in the future?
Well, the nature of the proposal, it doesn't authorize large multifamily. It only, the solution has to fit within the structure of a single family home. So if you cannot, under the proposal, build a building that it would be larger than what's allowed for a single family home. The difference is you can subdivide the interior into 1, 2, or 3, or 4 units as of right. And one of the realities of housing is, if you have a housing cost and you divide it by 2 or 3 or 4, the cost per unit goes down. That's simple logic. There were fear mongers at the hearing who said, oh, this is going to open up, tiny little lots with 300 apartments. No, it's not. That's not what the proposal says. And we were very intentional in trying to be respectful of the sort of the physical and even the demographic structure of Woodbridge, but yet opening up opportunities taking the single family homes and making them small scale multifamily opportunities consistent with the local zoning and consistent with the public health code. So that's the argument.
Mhm. Thank you. So any other questions that people might have? I see another one here in the chat. How and what can any of us do, again, related to the question of where's the hope? And might you speak to the idea of creating local municipal housing committees to stimulate local discussion about change?
Well, it's very, very appropriate to the Courtney's good question. Every town's housing plan can be improved. And, and in my mind, it's not just we talk about density, units per acre all the time, which is a very misleading metric. My mantra and that of many people in the land use committee is I can show you 2 units per acre that looks overly dense and ugly, and I can show you 25 units per acre that looks just fine. It depends on the design and the context. So people get caught up in this, oh my God, we can't have more than 10 units per acre. Well, that's a ridiculous discussion because it's how you do it. But the point being is that every town, many of our zoning codes across the state are stuck in the 1950s. They haven't been revised in decades. Energy efficiency, global warming, climate change, solar access. We need a much more robust movement in Connecticut that marries environmental sustainability with multifamily housing. And we also need to look at, the exclusionary practices that really should be swept away. And, these totally unnecessary procedural things, they look fine on paper, but they cost money, they create delay, they create uncertainty. There's a very real dynamic where a developer looks at a, potential, affordable housing opportunity, and they're scared away by the fact that the regulation is so imprecise and vague that they're afraid they get to the end of the process and they get denied and they won't get relief in the courts just because the regulation is vague or cumbersome. So if you're on a local housing committee, there are many opportunities to work with your, and again, you don't need to be a PhD in planning to do this, but just take your local legislators aside and say, why do we need this? Why do we need that? And I'm not talking about dismantling the structure of our town, but let's streamline the process because that will create the ability to build things that can come to market quickly is a hugely important part of the incentive. So everybody can work on every local town zoning code to make those types of improvements.
Thank you. Any other questions? We have just a minute or 2 left, so maybe one final question. Nancy?
I'd like to ask Tim what he thinks the chances are for not having 169 towns, regionalization, I guess you'd call it, or combining them.
Yeah, well, not in my lifetime. You remember the history of this. Connecticut eliminated counties in 1965 in the Constitutional Convention. Probably, I'm sure some of it was intentional, but probably the dumbest governmental decision in the history of mankind because we wedded ourselves to this structure of 169 little municipalities that make all these important decisions about our lives. Now, the court system is really the only part of our state that is still somewhat on a county basis. Now, that said, there have always been every year bills in the legislature to incentivize regional cooperation. There are some regional school districts that are 2, 3, 4 towns, and of course, in those instances, there are very well documented, savings. Instead of 4 health directors, we have one, and the one person, maybe with an assistant, can do the job, and the taxpayers benefit and the public service does not benefit. So if we could try to move more to that model in our, land use regulation, the national example that everybody talks about is Greater Louisville, or Louisville, as they say, where they went from city government to county government, and everybody agrees 25 years later that it was a really good move because it streamlined services and it improved planning and all this other stuff. If we could do something like that in Connecticut and go to regional planning organizations, we would insulate the decision makers from this, enormous pressure that is brought to bear on our local land use commissions. We would, streamline the process. They would, of necessity, they would get rid of all these unnecessary procedural rules and bells and whistles. It would be across the board improvement. But you know what? So for that to happen, who has to give up something? That the local towns have to give up power. And that's why it's probably never going to happen anytime, at least anytime soon. You remember, if you change something, if you give power to somebody else, the government, somebody else has to give it up, and that's the hard part.
So they're not thinking of the greater good.
They're thinking of their own fiefdoms. So.
Well, I want to thank you so much, Tim. I've learned so much and am so grateful for you sharing your wisdom with us. And I am going to turn it over to Nancy so she can talk a little bit more about some more upcoming programs.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Tim.
Wonderful. I know we have a lot of good writers in this group of people that are listening. So you're asking what you can do. I would think if we started all really putting time into writing letters to the editor, maybe an op-ed, your local paper, I don't know, we just have to get it out there. We have to make our views known and expressed and expose the difficulties with living in a segregated state.
Can we
So,
contact, I'm sorry, can we contact our legislators if we know the bill numbers that Tim has referred to and urge them to support them, find out where they are, talk to them about it?
And Ken, I wanted to ask Tim, are the only 2 bills we're talking about HB 6611 and then Senate Bill 1024?
1024 is the desegregate Connecticut bill. That is still alive. 6611 is the fair share bill. That died on Monday.
Okay. So let's write about the Senate bill that's still active, the fair. Which one is that? The fair share housing?
No, that's the desegregate Connecticut bill.
Oh, desegregate Connecticut, yes. So desegregate Connecticut has a website and it's desegregate.ct.org. So they will give you information and you can use that to put your writing skills to work and contact your legislators. That's the most important thing you can do because they need to hear from you. You can also attend rallies, news conferences. There's one in Deep River on this Saturday at 2 p.m. and Desegregate Connecticut is sponsoring that. Get out there. So I just thought you did a fantastic job, Tim, in breaking things down and letting us see where it came from. I remember reading The Color of Law and hearing Rothstein speak at a conference, and it's a wonderful book. I highly recommend it. So moving on, our next Justice in Action Presents program will be on June 2nd at 7 p.m. when the topic will be Income Inequality, Facts, Fair Revenue, and Relief with guest speaker Puya Jarami from Recovery from All. Recovery for All. It's a group of 44 faith-based and other organizations. So we hope to see you there. Thank you for attending tonight's program, and special thanks to Tim for the great presentation. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Good night.
Thank you all so much. God bless.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks
It's a
again,
blessing.
Tim.
It's a blessing.
Good to see you, Lou. Take care.
It's good to see you. Good to see you, Tracy. Jen.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Tracy.
Bye-bye. Thanks.